What's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. A couple of interesting stories for you guys today. The first story that I've got for you guys today, the official competitor list for the Vancouver Pro Show just came out, so that's this weekend's show. And honestly, it's a pretty small lineup, although I wouldn't say it's surprisingly small because we really hadn't heard very many bodybuilders talking about doing this show. You've got Chicago the week after this, then Dubai the week after that. But I was surprised to see Hassan Mustafa's name not on this list. But you did have Slavoj Bednar, Tim Budashim, Yisheng Chen, Stanimal, John Jewett, Hussein Kaleta, Diogo Nunez, Jay Placencia, Robin Strand, and Beef Stu Stuart Sutherland. So I say that I'm surprised to not see Hassan in this mix because if you remember back when he did Toronto, he was constantly saying, you know, I'm 3 weeks out, I'm 2 weeks out, I'm 1 week out from Toronto, but I'm 6, 7, or 8 weeks out from Vancouver. So a lot of people kind of attributed his look in Toronto, which was pretty bad conditioning-wise, to maybe it was just a warm-up show for Vancouver because he was planning on doing Vancouver, which was, you know, like a month and a half later. And I guess there's a chance he still does it, but I'm pretty sure this is a finalized list, but I guess we'll see. I was happy to see Tim Budashim in this lineup. Stanimal had told me he was doing it, but I think the main focus going into this show with two guys that had committed to it was Beef Stu and John Jewett. And I think realistically you probably are mostly looking at those two, and then maybe also Tim and Robin Strand, who was fourth in Toronto. So let's do a little bit of a Vancouver preview at less than a week out from some of these guys, starting with Tim Budashim because he just posted an update today. And Tim, he's interesting because he looks really impressive on Instagram. Like in these pictures, undeniably, he looks big, he looks dry, he looks grainy, he looks conditioned. But for some reason, it really just hasn't seemed to translate very well recently into high placings on stage. And for these updates being 6 days out, I think he looks extremely impressive. It's just, like I said, if you look back at some of these recent placings where you could say the exact same thing before those shows, he was looking great on Instagram and then it just didn't translate. Like, for example, going into the New York Pro, he was looking really good and he ended up 7th in New York. And then again, Toronto Pro, same thing. He looked really good going into that show and ended up 5th at the Toronto Pro, which I would argue is maybe even worse than 7th at the New York Pro, because the New York Pro, there was a ton of guys. It was a really deep lineup. Toronto Pro, not so much. So 5th being kind of comparable to 7th in a much weaker lineup. That's kind of why it makes it difficult for me to look at him in this lineup, even with the Vancouver lineup being not that deep relative to some of these other shows that we've seen. It's really hard for me to make the argument that Tim is going to be one of the top 2 guys here, just based on his track record with, you know, the New York Pro and then an even smaller show like Toronto. But for what it's worth, I got to give him credit. In these pictures, he looks great. How will he look on stage, I guess, is the real question. Now, this is the latest update from John Jewett. This would be 7 days out, so 1 day further out than Tim Budashim in his update. And John looks very impressive. But the thing is, so John did place ahead of Tim Budashim in Toronto. We saw them both at that show. John was 3rd. Tim was 5th, and John looked really, it's kind of similar, but kind of not, because John looked really conditioned in a lot of his Instagram updates going into the show. And while I felt he did still look pretty good on the Toronto stage, I felt like the conditioning didn't quite match what we had seen on Instagram. And we really haven't seen John compete that many times as an open bodybuilder to really get an idea of how consistent or inconsistent the conditioning actually is on stage. He came from 212, but open is like a whole different ballgame. So maybe he comes in a lot tighter at this show. But my point is, I feel like he was a little bit off the mark from what we saw on Instagram in Toronto, and he still beat Tim there and was 3rd. So for that reason, I view John as like one of the favorites in this lineup, albeit it's a weaker lineup. And I should also mention, I did double check today Hassan's Instagram to see if he had any mention of Vancouver recently, and I don't see any. He hasn't announced that he's not doing it, but he also hasn't really been posting any physique updates now for like the past couple of weeks. And he was one of the earliest guys to say they were doing Vancouver, so I'm a bit surprised to not see him on that list. If it was a deadline thing or whatever, Hassan was one of the guys saying he was doing Vancouver the earliest on, like 8 or 9 weeks out he was saying he was doing it. So when we talk about these guys and how they're going to place, we'll kind of put Hassan as an asterisk that maybe he does show up, maybe he doesn't. But for now, I guess we'll kind of leave him out of this conversation because he's not on the list. Now, speaking of conditioning, though, Stanimal posted some updates today and yesterday and the day before. He's looking really sharp going into this show the week of. And the last time that we saw Stanimal compete, he was in crazy condition. I kind of wonder, though, if he has put on any size since the last time we saw him compete. I really like the condition that he brings. But to me, he doesn't look much bigger in these updates. And maybe that's just because he came from men's physique to then classic physique to then open bodybuilding. So kind of over the course of his career, when we went a long time without seeing him on stage, we would see pretty big jumps in size and muscle mass on his frame because he was kind of bouncing up divisions so quickly. And I feel like even though it's been a while, or, relatively it's been a while since we've seen Stanimal compete, it doesn't seem like he's added a whole lot of size, at least from what I can see in these updates. And particularly, I'm talking about the lower body. That was one of the things I wanted to see him bring up in this offseason going into the next time we saw him compete, which is now. The lower body doesn't seem like it's really came up, but his conditioning does look fantastic. And in a lineup like this, like I said, this is really not the deepest lineup. A guy that comes in crazy condition, maybe they're not the biggest or maybe not even the most balanced, but if he comes in here shredded to the bone, it might go a long way in this lineup. He could be one of the top guys here. And then finally, I wanted to talk about Beef Stu because, in my opinion, he's kind of my favorite to win this show, to be honest with you guys. Out of all these guys, I think John's a top contender, but I think Stu, for me, is the guy that I want to see win this show, and I also think can win this show. Now, the last really significant update that we saw from Stu was the guest posing video from the Branch Warren Classic, where I think he looked really impressive, and this would have put him, I guess this would have been 2 weeks out from the show. Now, I've said this before, and one of the things that surprised me about Stu in some of the shows that he's done recently was how big he looked next to these guys. Like standing next to Tonio, even though Tonio's not the biggest guy, Stu just looked a lot bigger than I thought he was. Next to Tonio, next to some of these other guys, did really well at some of these bigger shows. And I say that because he's a relatively newer pro. He hasn't been around that long, but I think he's really, size-wise, hanging in with some of these top guys, conditioning-wise, he's like right there. So with Stu, you've got a big open guy that has done well at some big open shows, albeit not won a show. Against, in this lineup, like I said, we talked about Stanimal, the smaller guy that came from 212. John Jewett, smaller guy that came from 212. Tim Budashim, probably one of the bigger guys in this lineup, but especially with the absence of Hassan Mustafa, you look at Beef Stu, he brings good conditioning, and he's a big open guy. I think he could do really well here and probably be, I'd say definitely in the top two. Probably one of the favorites to win this thing. Personally, he's the guy that I want to see win. I think he's also doing Chicago, though. So he's got a couple more chances at that Olympia qualification. But I have a feeling going into this Vancouver one, seeing the lineup, Stu might be the guy here. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below about this lineup, about the competitors. Who do you think is going to win? Let me know your top three in the comments down below. But the video's not done. Next up, I wanted to talk about the latest updates from Neckzilla, Rubiel Mosquera, now about 2.5 to 3 weeks out from the Dubai Pro in these updates. These updates coming from some of the coaches at Oxygen Gym, not posted by Rubiel himself, so you guys might not have seen them. But I think these are significant because obviously we got two updates here. This one from the back from a different guy than the one we're going to talk about after this. But we haven't really seen Rubiel in any of these updates from the back or hitting back poses or seen his hamstrings and glutes. Now, again, we're getting closer. We're about 2.5 weeks out from the Dubai Pro now. We're getting like really into crunch time. And I wonder if it's strategic that he doesn't really show his back. And the reason I say that is because when Rubiel posts a lot of his own updates, he almost never shows his back, and he almost certainly never shows his hamstrings. And when I look at this update, he really doesn't have a bad back. It's wide, It seems thick. It could use some work, but it doesn't show the most detail. His back shots are where you really see him not show the most conditioning. You look at his hamstrings, yeah, his legs are freaking huge, but you don't really see a lot of detail there. You don't see deep lines, those deep corded, separated hamstrings. You don't see any striations in the glute. You kind of see like the reminiscent shape of a Christmas tree in the lower back, but overall, to me, when I look at his back poses, I'm mainly just seeing size. I'm seeing width. I'm seeing a big dude, but I don't see a lot of detail at all from the back. And again, we're no longer talking about 6, 8, 10 weeks out. We're about 2.5 weeks out now. We're getting close. But then there's also this other update of Rubiel from the front taken on the same day, and I think he looks a lot more impressive from the front. I mean, obviously, you've got his standout, trademark, massive quads. That's one thing. But you can see his traps really well from the front. The crazy separation in his chest is really starting to show, especially in this lighting. Honestly, for such a big dude, he's got really deep separated abs. His arms are looking really vascular. His shoulders are looking nice and capped, and you can see some striations in the shoulder even from the front. For a mass monster like Rubiel, I feel like this is more of what you want to see conditioning-wise from the front, especially when you look at the chest and see striations like that. That's a really good sign for a guy as big as Rubiel. And the way he hits that most muscular and kind of brings his traps down and forward to where they're like super popping, and really you can see why his nickname is Neckzilla in that pose. But when you look at the difference between the back and the front, it makes you wonder if he's one of those guys where he's better at getting lean on one side of his body, because we've seen that happen with guys like Derek Lunsford, for example. His back shots, back double bicep, back lat spread, they're lights out shots, conditioned from head to toe, dry, grainy, hard. But from the front with Derek, you're not really seeing that detail in the chest. Even in his biceps, in the front double bicep, you don't see like that crazy separation in the arms from the front, but you see pretty good separation in the arms from the back. Then Hadi, for example, shredded to the bone from the front. I wouldn't even say that he's not shredded from the back, but I would say Hadi is a guy that from the front is a lot more conditioned than he is from the back. Or at least that was the case until these past two Arnold Classics, where I think it's the best Hadi we've ever seen. But at the Olympia, I feel like that was the difference between Hadi and Derek. Hadi was a lot more lean from the front. Derek was a lot more lean and complete from the back. So could we see something similar with Rubiel, where he's a guy that looks really good from the front and maybe even from the sides, then he turns around from the back and you just see like a super lack of detail, and those two poses could cost him quite a bit. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. That's going to wrap it up for the video. Hope you liked it. But make sure you like the video, comment, subscribe, click the bell notification, all that good stuff. And as always, I love you guys. Appreciate you guys. Nick Strength and Power signing out. All right, guys, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the content. Also, check out my Instagram at NickStrengthPower, my Facebook page, which is simply Nick Strength and Power, my secondary YouTube channel, Nick Strength and Vlogs, for vlogs and bonus content that you will not see on this channel. And consider subscribing to my third YouTube channel, Nick Strength and Pokemon, which is all things Pokemon and trading card games, completely unrelated to this channel. So if you're into that, give that one a look. And all links to merchandise and social media will be in the description box below. If you guys want a Nick Strength and Power t-shirt, that will be in the Shopify link below. Have a great day.